Let's get started on our exam 2 review. Just as a reminder, the review for exam 2 covers bones, cartilage, and joints. Let's start by looking at cartilage. Things I need you to remember about cartilage. So, cartilage, connective tissue, 3 different types of cartilage. Hyaline cartilage, fibrocartilage, elastic cartilage. Hyaline cartilage is very smooth. It means glass-like. It's there at the articular cartilage joints between the ribs and the sternum, the precursor to all the long bones. Fibrocartilage is a shock absorber. It looks like dense, regular connective tissue with big collagen fiber bundles. Elastic cartilage, outer ear, larynx, able to be distorted and it will bounce back to its original shape. You see lots of frayed-looking fibers throughout elastic cartilage. Cartilage is very solid. Cartilage is avascular. So blood vessels cut through cartilage. Bone is really porous. It's really hard, but it's really porous. Lots of channels for cells and blood vessels, that sort of thing. Not so much with cartilage. That means cartilage is really tough, but it also means cartilage heals very slowly. If you've ever had an injury where you damage something of cartilage, you understand that length of time that's necessary for you to heal in that case. So cartilage, cells of cartilage. Remember, we have chondrocytes, the mature cartilage cell. We have chondroblast, laying down new cartilage matrix, and we have chondroclasts, breaking down the cartilage matrix. Cartilage can grow either appositionally, like rings around the tree, or it can grow interstitially. So you've got your cartilage cells that undergo mitosis, and when they do, they push out on the matrix. Interstitial means from the inside out. Appositional means to add rings around the outside. Cartilage can do both. I'm not worried a lot about, for instance, the chemical composition of cartilage or anything like this. No basic function. You should look at those tissue slides and be able to distinguish them. But otherwise, don't get too lost in the details of cartilage. Obviously, the bulk of your exam is going to discuss bones. So bones, long bones, short bones, flat bones, irregular bones, those sort of shape classifications are important. But let's talk about sort of the general structure of a long bone. All right, so any long bone, the center part is the diaphysis. The widened ends are then epiphyses. We have a line right there. In juveniles, this will be the epiphyseal plate. More on that in a bit. The bone is wrapped connective tissue. In that connective tissue, which is called the periosteum, we find cells that add new layers of bone. Those would be osteoblasts. Let's take a cross section here of this long bone and look at it like this. So that in the center we have the marrow cavity. Separating the bone from the bone marrow is another membrane. That membrane is the endosteum. So remember, the endosteum separates bone from bone marrow. Then you get compact bone. And on the outside, you would have the periosteum. So if you were to saw right through the middle of your thigh bone, that's pretty much what you'd see. You'd have bone marrow in the middle, the endosteum, this really thin membrane separating the bone from the bone marrow, and then you would have layers of compact bone, and then the periosteum on the outside. Some of the fibers from the periosteum actually will grow through into the bone to secure it there. Those fibers are called Sharpie's fibers. And they actually anchor that periosteum to the bone. All right. Things to remember about bones. First of all, bones are both hard and flexible. Bones are composites. Composite means that we're made up of multiple materials so that we can get the properties of each of those materials. There is both an inorganic part of bone and an organic part of bone. When you see the inorganic part of bone, you need to associate that with a mineral salt called hydroxyapatite. And this is the hardness of bone. The organic part of bone, when you see that, I need you to think collagen. This is the flexible part of the bone. You can take a chicken bone and drop it in vinegar, and eventually the vinegar will eat away the calcium salts and leave you with nothing but a collagen model of the bone. It's kind of flexible. It's fun at parties. Be super popular there, soaking your chicken bones in vinegar so you can show them all later. So, organic, flexible, inorganic, hard. What we get is a material that is both hard and flexible. Your bones will bend significantly before they break. let's apply this idea. All right. We have a childhood disease. It's called rickets. Rickets is caused by either a lack of calcium or a lack of vitamin D in the diet. The result of this is you can't absorb the calcium either because it's not there, because the vitamin D is not there, and we get reduced calcium in the bones. And that hydroxyapatite is a calcium based substance. So if we take the calcium, we reduce the calcium in the bones. We demineralize the bones. We have a lack of mineralization. Now the collagen, the flexible part of the bone, is still there. But the hardness of the bone is lost. Children with rickets, their bones will bend under their weight. You can Google, there's some good x-rays of children with rickets, and you'll see the femur bend at this weird angle, or the spine, or the long bones of the arm. Any bone that's taking any weight for any reason can bend under that stress because the hardness is gone. And all that's left is the flexibility. Now, so rickets, we have a lack of mineralization. We go to the opposite end of that scale. We can look at a disease called osteogenesis imperfecta. Here we have malformed collagen fibers. Collagen is the flexible part of bone. Now that part's not right. So what we have here is bones that are no longer flexible. This is also called brittle bone disease. The bones aren't flexible and they will break. Effects of osteogenesis imperfecta range from not compatible with life to severely debilitating. Stunted growth as the bone heals weirdly. A lot of them don't survive birth because bones break while they're being born. The bones are just super fracturable, fragile, however you want to think of it, because they're brittle. Because the organic part of bone doesn't form. The organic part of bone is the flexible part of bone. The inorganic part of bone is bone's hardness. And if we screw with that balance of hardness and flexibility, either the bone becomes too flexible or it becomes too brittle. All right. So, bone is a composite. That's an important thing to remember. General structure of bone, both in like a cross section or the long bone structure, that's important. Knowing the difference between a long bone, flat bone, short bone, that sort of thing. We're not even going to talk about that because it's all very straightforward and easy to understand. So let's talk about growth patterns of bone. Bone will either grow through endochondral ossification or intramembranous ossification. ossification, the formation of bone. Now, I'm not worried that you know the steps of this. That's not relevant. You do need to know the end result. Intramembranous ossification is how skull bones form. You start with this sort of membrane, and bone forms within that connective tissue membrane. This is how, for instance, the skull forms. Intramembranous ossification is usually for flat bones. Now, endochondral ossification is formation of bone inside a cartilage model, and this is how long bones are formed. Again, I'm not worried about the step-by-step mechanism here. I'm worried that you understand that intramembranous ossification is how long bones form from inside this hyaline cartilage that we started with. So one of the things about cartilage is that because it is avascular, it has to be very thin. So you start with this sort of cartilage model thing, and the chondrocytes in the middle will start to die. And that's going to trigger blood vessels to move into this area. And that's going to bring more nutrients and oxygen and stuff to take care of those cells that are in the middle. In the middle, in the diaphysis, where bone starts to form inside this cartilage, that is your primary ossification center. And I'm not going to go over the steps. Bone replaces the cartilage, and this is all going to calcify, and then it's going to get hollowed out. And then at the end of the bone, at the epiphysis, the same thing's going to happen. You get a secondary ossification center there. Again, I'm not going over this step by step. Interestingly, you're left with a band of cartilage right there called the epiphyseal cartilage. This cartilage grows interstitially. It pushes out. And what's going to happen is that cartilage is going to grow this way, and it's going to go this way, and it's going to push the epiphysis away from the diaphysis. One of the points that I really need to get across here is this, that epiphyseal plate, that is where bones get longer. Bones don't get longer from the middle. The ends are pushed away from the center. Think about how a tree grows. If you go outside right now and you put a nail in a tree, and you come back 50 years from now, where's that nail going to be? It's going to be higher, it's going to be lower, it's going to be in the same place. It's going to be in the same place, just more deeply embedded. So, bones get longer at the epiphyseal plate, not from the center. We're pushing those away as we add cartilage there. When that epiphyseal plate seals with bone, you're done growing. Let's apply this. The word achondroplasia is A is without, chondro is cartilage. So we have a lack of cartilage growth here. Achondroplasia people are very short in stature because their bones, their long bones, stop growing sooner. Those growth plates seal because the cartilage doesn't grow very quickly. The head and the torso tend to be normal size because most of those bones form through intramembranous ossification. There's no cartilage involved. Achondroplagic dwarves are little people. Some of them have a show on TLC. One is a very well-known neonatologist at Texas Children's Hospital in Houston. But their arms and legs are shorter because those growth plates seal sooner. So you need to know the difference between interstitial or intramembranous growth and uh, endochondral growth. That's important, right? Intramembranous ossification is for flat bones like the skull bones. Endochondral ossification is for long bones. Understand growth from the epiphyseal plate. Go back and look at those slides. And remember, that's where the bones are getting longer. Bones aren't getting longer from the middle, they're getting longer at the epiphyseal plate. And the epiphysis is pushed away from the diaphysis. At puberty, what happens is hormones cause that bone to grow very quickly, and it overtakes the growing cartilage and seals those growth plates. And then you're going to be that height forever. Okay. Bones have a lot of roles. We've got support and all structure stuff. But really, one of my main concerns in terms of the function of bone here is bone's role as a calcium reservoir. Most of the calcium of your body, 99% of it actually, is stored in the bones. So it becomes necessary that we borrow this from time to time. So one of the major roles here is bones and calcium homeostasis. Your blood calcium fluctuates throughout the day. What would happen if you had too much calcium in your blood? That condition is called hypercalcemia. Too much calcium in the blood. You're going to be tired, lethargic. You might get kidney stones. But mostly you're lethargic, cranky, tired. Now, what if you have hypocalcemia? Not enough calcium in your blood. Symptoms of hypocalcemia: muscle spasms, especially in the hands and the feet. Then bigger muscle spasm, laryngospasm, which is spasms of the muscles in the throat, and then you asphyxiate and die. Too much calcium, you're tired all the time. Too little calcium, you're going to die. So this is the condition that our bodies are focused on correcting. And we do this through the use of hormones. The major hormone for calcium homeostasis is parathyroid hormone. How does it work? Well, parathyroid hormone raises blood calcium. How does it do that? It activates osteoclasts. Osteoclasts are cells that break down bone, they dissolve the bone, and they put that matrix back in your bloodstream. So you don't die. So as your calcium fluctuates throughout the day, parathyroid hormone is kicking in. You borrow some from your bones, you put it back later. Other hormones of note here: vitamin D, which allows you to absorb calcium from your blood. Calcitonin is not one we're concerned with because it doesn't really have a function in adults. Testosterone and estrogen cause bone deposition. One of the things we see in women after menopause is the development of osteoporosis, because without estrogen, your body continues to borrow calcium from the bones with parathyroid hormone, but it doesn't pay it back later. So you lose bone density. As you go through and study the bones, again, big picture ideas here. Calcium homeostasis is a very big idea. Structural hierarchy, big important idea. Understanding what the different bone cells are doing, um, how bones grow, endochondral versus intramembranous ossification. All of these things are important for bone. I think if anything else, we'll come back to it. In a minute, we'll work through some review question sort of things. Joints, I'm not focused very much on joints. You need to know joints in terms of the idea of something like a diarthrotic joint versus synarthrotic. And the stylus is dying on me. Or amphiarthrotic joints. I'm not going to ask you to name the joints. I'm not going to ask you to name structures in the joint. But you do need to know that a diarthrotic joint is freely movable. You need to understand those structures, the synovial membrane, synovial fluid, and all these things that are there to reduce friction in the moving joint. Friction is your enemy. All right. I think probably the best thing to do here is just to work through some practice things or some big picture ideas that I'm concerned with. All right. So you have a patient who is experiencing muscle spasms post removal of the thyroid gland. All right, so what do you suspect here? Well, the thyroid gland is this gland that's in your throat, and on the back of the thyroid gland, you have between 4 and 8 parathyroid glands. And if the parathyroids are damaged during the surgery, well, then you have hypoparathyroidism. Not enough parathyroid hormone. Now, remember what parathyroid hormone does. Parathyroid hormone raises the calcium in your blood. So if you don't have enough parathyroid hormone, that's going to lower the calcium in your blood, and that is hypocalcemia. And hypocalcemia would cause these muscle spasms. So if you ever have your thyroid gland removed, they'll monitor you in the hospital for several days afterwards just to make sure that you don't have any issues with the parathyroid glands. one thing that we talked about here, bone is a composite. We talked about rickets and osteogenesis imperfecta. Those always make good questions. Achondroplasia and that issue with the growth plate, that's something to look at as well. The layout of bone. Oh, there we go. Compact bone versus spongy bone. There was something I forgot. And the structure here. You need to know that the unit of compact bone is the osteon. The osteon consists of a central canal with little blood vessels in it, surrounded by concentric lamellae, like so. Situated along these will be the actual bone cells, and you'll see little thin channels cut through there. Now, those little channels are called canaliculi, tiny canals, because bone is not, well, a bone is solid. You're not diffusing through bone. So these little channels are cut through so that nutrients can diffuse from the blood vessels here in the central canal out to each little cell. The space around each cell is called the lacuna. Mm. Compact bone is the hard, regular bone. It's what provides the strength of bone. Spongy bone looks like a sponge. Go back and look at those pictures. Different sort of structure there. We don't get osteons. There's no osteons in spongy bone. Find spongy bone at the epiphyses, the widened ends of long bones, um, that sort of thing. Bone marrow, you need to know that red marrow is where blood comes from. Yellow marrow is just fat. And the adult red marrow is found in the proximal epiphyses of the humerus and the femur, so the hip and the shoulder, and then in flat bones. And this makes blood. All right, so now for sort of a public service announcement here. If you aren't on the bone marrow donor list, you should be. Bone marrow donors are high in demand because the supply for bone marrow donation is very low. Of the people who match for bone marrow donation, a great deal of them back out after they match, mostly because it's a fear of the procedure. For some reason, people have this idea that um, they're going to drill a giant hole in you and suck bone marrow out. This is not the case. A lot of times with bone marrow donations, they'll just take stem cells out of your blood and do a stem cell transplant. They are doing a direct bone marrow transplant. They'll take bone marrow from the proximal epiphysis of the femur, so your hip, and they'll take a needle and put it into the femur and pull that bone marrow out. You're freaking out right now. You're like, oh, hell, they're going to put a needle in the bone. At some point, you'll probably have to start an interosseous IV where you put a needle in the bone. Bone is hard and flexible. You don't have to drive it in with a hammer or anything. You just push the needle through into the bone, and the bone will give. You're not breaking it. It's hard and flexible. It's a composite. I'm telling you, this bone marrow donation thing is much easier on you than it is on the recipient of the transplant who's got some sort of leukemia or bone marrow cancer that they need this for. Always give this little spiel about bone marrow donation. And a few semesters ago, I actually had a girl that got called in to be a donor, and she went somewhere and they harvested bone marrow from her. I felt responsible for that. I don't know if I felt guilty or proud, one of the two. This exam, I would encourage you to focus mainly on bones in the skeletal system with little diversion over into joints. Most of what we care about with joints are diarthrotic joints. I'm not going to ask you to name joints. You should be able to tell me that like a suture is a synarthrotic joint, right? It's an immovable joint. But I'm not worried about just a grand amount of detail there. Like I'm not going to make you name ligaments in the knee. But you should know that like synovial joints are freely movable joints, they've got that synovial fluid in them, this sort of thing. In terms of impact, this should be a rather low impact exam. It's good because the next thing that we're going to talk about is muscles. And muscles are deep. There's a lot going on in muscles. So that's coming up. Now, something else here is this exam at the moment, obviously you're not going to have a lab exam at the same time because you don't have the lab material. Your lab material will be posted Tuesday. And we'll work in the skeletal stuff then. We'll decide on a date for that later. So don't worry about it right now. Worry about it later. Next week, you'll have pretty much the week to do this. And I think that should do it. Nothing else comes to mind. If anything else comes up, I'll send out an announcement if I think of anything else. But I think you're fine. This, again, should not be an extremely difficult thing. The most difficult concepts there are that idea of calcium homeostasis, parathyroid hormone, and then like terminology in terms of structure. Bone is a composite, the organic, inorganic thing, that's important. Make sure you focus on that, and I think you'll be fine. So look for this exam next week. Good luck.